The crystal water glass rang out with a sharp clink, clink, clink that cut through the warm chatter of our Sunday roast. "If I could just have everyone's attention for a moment," Mark said, a charismatic, confident smile stretching across his face as he stood at the head of my dining table. I paused with my fork halfway to my mouth. "To new beginnings," my son-in-law announced, raising his glass high. "To the launch of Apex International Consulting. It's a massive leap, I know, but this new business venture is going to secure our family's future forever." The air banished from my lungs. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet, a sudden icy grip seizing the back of my neck. I am Eleanor, 68 years old, and a widow of a man who is a master of illusion. Watching Mark beam at my daughter Clara, I felt a sickening wave of vertigo wash over me. Everyone else cheered. Clara looked up at him with such blind, radiant pride that it broke my heart, but my hands were trembling violently beneath the thick linen tablecloth. 30 years ago, in this exact room, sitting in that exact chair, my late husband Richard had raised his Scotch glass and spoken those identical words. A massive leap, consulting, securing our future. It wasn't a business venture then, it was an elaborate smokescreen. A phantom company constructed entirely of lies, forged documents, shell accounts, and a secret second family living out of state. I forced my mouth into a stiff, congratulatory smile, raising my own glass with a shaking hand. Mark caught my eye from across the table. His smile remained bright and perfect, but his eyes were dead, flat, and calculating, watching closely to see if I bought the performance. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced politeness. While Clara excitedly passed the roasted potatoes and my grandson Leo babbled about his toy trucks, my mind was anchored decades in the past. Richard's phantom firm had been called Summit Global Advisors. He had printed glossy business cards and rented an impressive-sounding P.O. box downtown. For 5 years, I had dutifully packed his bags for critical overseas networking trips, completely unaware he was actually 3 states away, playing doting father to 2 little girls I didn't know existed. The betrayal hadn't just broken my heart, it had financially and emotionally gutted me. By the time I found the property tax bill for a townhouse in Seattle hidden in the spare tire compartment of his sedan, the debt he had secretly accrued in our name was staggering. I had spent the second half of my life meticulously rebuilding my shattered world, fiercely protecting Clara from the ugly truth of who her father really was. She still believed he had died a hard-working corporate hero, a myth I swallowed my pride to perpetuate just to save her the trauma. Now, looking at Mark, the similarities were too precise to dismiss as mere coincidence. The vague terminology. The sudden, desperate need for independence from his stable accounting job. The polished, rehearsed delivery of his grand announcement. After dessert, I watched him excuse himself to the patio to take a crucial investor call, pulling the heavy sliding glass door tightly shut behind him. I quietly stepped into the darkened kitchen, pressing my back against the cool refrigerator, and watched him through the blinds. He wasn't talking on the phone at all. He was furiously typing a text message, looking nervously over his shoulder. And, over the next few weeks, I made a habit of dropping by Clara's house more frequently. I used my grandson, Leo, as my excuse, bringing over freshly baked muffins or new library books. In reality, I had become a silent, hyper-vigilant observer in my daughter's home. I started hunting for the subtle, terrifying patterns I had blindly missed with Richard decades ago. It didn't take long to find them. The first red flag was the phone. Mark's smartphone was suddenly an extension of his hand. When it wasn't in his palm, it was resting on the kitchen counter or the coffee table, always face down, always on silent. If it vibrated, he would snatch it up with a lightning-fast reflex, angle the screen away from Clara, and casually stroll out to the garage to reply. "Just keeping work at work, honey," he'd tell her with a charming, apologetic shrug. It was an eerie echo of the exact phrase Richard used to pacify my early suspicions. Then came the erratic schedule. Mark claimed he was spending 12 hours a day at a shared workspace downtown, securing seed money and meeting with logistics partners. Yet, For a man supposedly grinding through exhausting startup meetings, he always came home looking remarkably refreshed, never stressed, and completely devoid of any specific details about his day. The dread in my chest solidified into cold, hard certainty the afternoon he announced his first overnight business trip. He was packing his sleek new leather duffel bag in the hallway when I walked past. Tucked neatly between his freshly pressed shirts was a brand new, expensive bottle of Tom Ford cologne. Mark had worn cheap Old Spice since the day he met my daughter. You don't buy $200 cologne to impress venture capitalists. I waited until Clara was upstairs, giving Leo a bath before I made my move. Mark was in the kitchen, pouring the last of the coffee into his travel mug before his supposed trip. I leaned against the counter, keeping my posture relaxed, my voice a picture of grandmotherly curiosity. "So, Mark," I began, smoothing out a wrinkle in my cardigan, "who exactly are you meeting with in Chicago? Clara mentioned you have a primary investor now." He froze. It was only for a fraction of a second, but I saw his shoulders stiffen under his crisp blazer. When he turned to face me, the charismatic son-in-law mask was firmly back in place, though his eyes remained hard. "It's a syndicate, Eleanor," he said smoothly. "Supply chain optimization. It's pretty technical, to be honest." "I used to manage the ledgers for Richard's firm," I replied, holding his gaze. "I know a bit about logistics. What's the lead partner's name?" A muscle feathered in his jaw. The charm vanished, replaced by a chilling, condescending smirk. He walked over and patted my shoulder, a heavy, patronizing gesture meant to make me feel small. "Eleanor, no offense, but the corporate landscape has evolved a little since the 90s. It's a lot of proprietary e-commerce infrastructure now. You wouldn't know the firm." He grabbed his keys and brushed past me, his hostility radiating in the narrow kitchen. As he walked out the door, he called back, "Tell Clara, I'll text her when I land." I stood perfectly still as the front door clicked shut. When I land. Just yesterday, he had explicitly promised Clara he was driving to Chicago to save the new company money on airfare. Clara was always a sensible girl, but over the next month, a quiet, desperate frugality crept into her household. I first noticed it when she poured me a cup of coffee during a Tuesday visit. Instead of the French roast she usually bought, it was a bitter store-brand powder. When I offered to take Leo to his afternoon tumbling class, Clara's eyes darted away, her cheeks flushing with heartbreaking embarrassment. "We actually paused his gymnastics for a bit, Mom," she murmured, scrubbing a perfectly clean countertop. "Mark says the new business needs every spare dime right now. The startup phase is just lean. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. My daughter was clipping coupons and rationing her toddler's activities, yet the math playing out in front of me was grotesquely lopsided. Just 3 days prior, Mark had strolled into my living room wearing a brand new pair of Italian leather loafers. He had casually mentioned securing a vendor discount, but I knew luxury when I saw it. Then there was the sudden appearance of a sleek, silver smartwatch and the premium golf clubs sitting in his trunk. Items, he claimed, were necessary for networking with high-net-worth clients. Richard used to say the exact same thing when he bought tailored suits while I agonized over our winter heating bill. The sickening discrepancy between Clara's anxiety and Mark's sudden indulgence was a blaring alarm. I waited until Clara went upstairs to fetch laundry, leaving me alone in her kitchen. I slid her laptop open on the island. She had left her browser logged into their joint checking account. I clicked on the recent transaction history, scanning for grocery and utility bills. Instead, my eyes locked onto a massive, recurring weekly transfer that made my blood run cold. The transfers were labeled simply as Apex operating expenses, bleeding thousands of dollars a month out of their joint savings. But the billing address attached to the transaction details was glaringly visible. 415 Sterling Avenue, Suite 900. Mark's prized downtown headquarters, the bustling hub of his new empire. The following Tuesday, while Mark supposedly had a marathon strategy session with his logistics team, I drove downtown. I parked 2 blocks away, pulling the collar of my trench coat up against the autumn chill. My heart hammered a familiar, dreadful rhythm against my ribs, as I walked into the sleek, marble-floored lobby of the Sterling building. I rode the elevator to the 9th floor, the knot in my stomach tightening with every passing second. The doors chimed open to a quiet, dimly lit hallway. I followed the brass plaques along the wall until I reached the heavy glass double doors of Suite 900. I pressed my hands against the cool glass and peered inside, bracing myself to see receptionists and ringing phones. There was absolutely nothing. The suite was entirely gutted. Raw concrete floors stretched out beneath exposed overhead pipes. A few stray wires dangled from the ceiling like dead vines. In the center of the cavernous, dusty room sat a single cheap folding chair and a discarded fast food bag. There were no whiteboards, no computers, no employees, just dead, hollow space. He was siphoning his family's money into a ghost town. Before I could process the sheer scale of the lie, the unmistakable ding of the elevator echoed at the far end of the hall. Heavy, familiar footsteps stepped off onto the carpet. I froze, suddenly trapped in the narrow corridor. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of my throat. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Mark's loafers against the carpeted hallway grew louder. With nowhere else to run, I threw my weight against the heavy steel door of the emergency stairwell just feet from Suite 900. It opened with a soft click, and I slipped inside, letting it ease shut until only a sliver of the hallway remained visible. Through the narrow gap, I watched Mark stroll past. He wasn't wearing his usual crisp blazer. Instead, he was dressed in a casual cashmere sweater I had never seen before, and he was holding his phone close to his mouth. "I'm here now," he murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. He didn't sound like a stressed entrepreneur. He sounded soft, intimate, and dangerously relaxed. I held my breath, terrified that the frantic beating of my heart would give me away. "I know, baby," Mark chuckled softly into the receiver. "I just had to play the dedicated husband this morning. Clara is completely clueless. She thinks the new operational costs are draining the accounts." He paused, listening to the person on the other end, a vile smirk playing on his lips. "The transfer went through yesterday. We have the deposit for the townhouse. I just need to keep up this startup fiction for a few more months, until the joint savings are fully liquidated, and then I'm out. I promise." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. The phantom business wasn't just a lie to hide an affair. It was a premeditated heist. He was systematically bankrupting my daughter to fund his escape with another woman. I knew better than to confront Clara immediately. If I barged in making wild accusations about a gutted office and an overheard phone call, Mark would simply pivot. He would call me a meddling, paranoid widow projecting her past trauma onto his innovative business model. He would isolate Clara, and I would lose her forever. I needed undeniable physical proof before I struck. 2 days later, I sat with Clara on her back patio, watching Leo chase butterflies across the fading autumn lawn. I wrapped both hands around my mug of cheap, bitter coffee, carefully choosing my words. "Sweetheart," I began softly, keeping my tone as light as possible. "I know this new company is putting a massive financial strain on you. Are you making sure your name is on the new corporate accounts, that you're actually seeing the ledgers?" Clara stiffened, her gaze snapping away from her son to look at me. "Mom, please, don't do this." "Do what, honey? I just want to make sure you're protected." "You're comparing him to Dad again," she sighed, rubbing her temples in exhaustion. "Mark is building a future for us. He's handling all the operational stress so I don't have to. It's incredibly complex, legal stuff." I swallowed the tight lump in my throat. "I just think a wife should have access to the paperwork, Clara. Just to be safe." "He keeps all the proprietary contracts locked up in his leather briefcase in the study. He even updated the combination dials yesterday because of the strict non-disclosure agreements. So please drop it." She thought she was shutting down a frustrating argument. Instead, she had just handed me a map. The opportunity finally arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Clara was at the dentist, and Mark was supposedly meeting with the venture capital group across town. Little Leo was sound asleep in his nursery, the baby monitor glowing softly on the kitchen counter. My hands were surprisingly steady as I slipped into Mark's dimly lit study. The room smelled of expensive cologne and deceit. There, sitting dead center on his mahogany desk, was the sleek, black leather briefcase. I approached it like a live bomb. It had twin brass combination locks, 3 digits each. Clara said he had updated the code just 2 days ago, the exact day I overheard him confirm the deposit for his secret townhouse. I thought about Richard. Cheating men are remarkably arrogant, and their passwords always reflect their true priorities. It wouldn't be Clara's birthday, nor Leo's. I thought back to the ghost office downtown, 415 Sterling Avenue, Suite 900. I rolled the left dial, 041. I rolled the right dial, 590, nothing. The brass latches held firm. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady thrum of rain against the window. What is his priority? The escape, the money. I thought about the exact dollar amount of that devastating weekly drain I had seen on Clara's laptop, exactly 4,500. It was the number that was buying his new life. I spun the left dial to 045. I spun the right dial to 0000, click. The heavy brass clasps sprang open like a gunshot in the quiet room. I lifted the leather lid, my stomach dropping into my shoes. There were no proprietary contracts or logistics spreadsheets. Instead, sitting on top of the stack of cashier's checks made out to a Chloe Vance, were 2 first-class, one-way tickets to Belize, departing next Friday, Sunday dinner. The exact same setting where this nightmare began. Mark sat at the head of the table, cutting his roast beef with an irritatingly smug precision. Next Friday is the big day, he announced, pouring Clara a glass of cheap wine while he drank from a premium vintage he had expensed. I'm flying down to Texas to finalize the supply chain integration. It's going to be a grueling weekend, but it means we finally cross the finish line. Clara smiled, though her eyes were heavy with exhausting, terrified frugality. I'm so proud of you, Mark. Texas? I asked, my voice dangerously soft as I set my fork down on the linen tablecloth. That's a rather long flight. Just a few hours, Eleanor. Nothing I can't handle. I imagine the flight to Belize is much longer, I said, reaching into my handbag. The dining room went dead silent. Mark's knife froze against his porcelain plate, producing a sharp, terrible screech that hung in the air. I pulled out the manila envelope I had meticulously prepared. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I simply slid the high-quality color copies of the one-way first-class tickets, the cashier's checks, and a printed photograph of the gutted, empty Suite 900 across the table. They came to a stop right next to his wine glass. Who is Chloe Vance, Mark? I asked, my voice perfectly steady, anchored by 30 years of surviving a man exactly like him. But Mark just stared at the tickets, his jaw slack, his phantom empire collapsing into dust. Word count, 23. The aftermath of a shattered marriage is a debris field I know intimately. It took weeks for the legal dust to settle. But the moment Mark saw those copies on the dining table, the fight went out of him. The undeniable proof stripped away his arrogant facade, leaving only the cowardly thief beneath. With my attorney's aggressive intervention, we froze the joint accounts that very Monday, cutting off his access before he could liquidate the final reserves. Mark packed his luxury bags and left the same night, his grand tropical escape reduced to a desperate, panicked retreat. Clara was devastated, of course. For a long time, the silence in her house was suffocating, heavy with the grief of a future that had been entirely fabricated. But as the months passed, the suffocating frugality lifted. We moved her and Leo into a beautiful, smaller home, closer to me, far away from the shadows of Apex International Consulting and the ghost office on Sterling Avenue. Sometimes I look at my daughter as she plays with my grandson in the garden, and my heart aches for the innocence she lost. I spent my entire adult life trying to protect her from the pain of my own past, shielding her from the reality of her father's betrayal. In the end, I couldn't save her from having her heart broken by the exact same kind of monster. But life has taught me that true protection isn't about keeping the monsters away forever. It's about giving your children the strength to survive them when they inevitably breach the walls. Richard's deception almost destroyed me, but it also forged me into a woman who could see the wolf in sheep's clothing. I paid a terrible price for that sight. But as I watch Clara rebuild her life, stronger and wiser than before, I know it was worth every tear.